Take two. Let's call this meeting of your Newark City Council order. Autumn, please call the roll.
Mr. Blake?
Here.
Mr. Bubb? Mr. Koss?
Here.
Mrs. Floyd?
Here.
Mr. Frazier?
Here.
Ms. Hall?
Here.
Mr. Lang?
Here.
Mr. Mangus?
Here.
Mr. Marmee?
Present.
And Mr. Rapp?
Here.
We have 9 here this evening. If you please rise for the invocation by Mr. Frazier.
Please bow your heads. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day you've given us, the opportunity to come in here and do the work of the people, Lord. And please be with us, and may we stay humble and stay focused and stay diligent. Please be with those that are suffering throughout the country, those that are hit by the hurricane, and those that are continuing to feel the pressure and the uncertainty of their homes and their lives being devastated. And may we come together and support them and do your will. And thank you for everything that you do us. Continue to bless our city. Continue to bless the opportunities before us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Ella, if you'd like to come on out. Ella's going to lead the pledge tonight. This is Ella Manning.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you, Mr. Frazier.
Next on the agenda tonight, we have caucus. That's the time for council to discuss anything pertaining to the agenda tonight. Do we have anything, Mr. Marmee?
President, make a motion to excuse Councilmember Bubb.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That passes. Thank you. Next on the agenda, we have the minutes of our September 5th, 2017 meeting. Is there a motion to approve those?
Motion.
Motion by Mr. Rath, second by Mr. Frazier. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That passes. Thank you. We have 2 reports of standing committees this evening, one from Finance and one from Service. Without objection, those will be received and filed. We also have 1 report from our city official, one from one from Stephen Johnson, our auditor, the operating report for the period ending August 31st, 2017. Without objection, that will be received and filed. Under communications this evening, we have Mayor Hall to present a proclamation for Hunger Action Month.
Thank you, President Ellington. Whereas hunger and poverty are issues of grave concern in the United States and the state of Ohio, Newark is committed to taking steps to raise awareness about the need to combat hunger in every part of our state and to provide additional resources that the citizens of Newark need. Newark is committed to working with the Mid-Ohio Food Bank and educating people about the role and importance of food banks in addressing hunger and raising awareness of the need to devote more resources and attention to hunger issues. More than 524,000 individuals in Ohio rely on food provided by the Mid-Ohio Food Bank annually. The Mid-Ohio Food Bank distributed more than 69 million pounds of food and groceries in 2016 through its network of food pantries, soup kitchens, shelters, and other community organizations. Food banks across the state, including Mid-Ohio Food Bank, will promote numerous events throughout the month of September to bring awareness and attention to encourage involvement in the efforts to end hunger in their local community. Now, therefore, I, Jeff Hall, Mayor of the great city of Newark, do hereby proclaim the month of September 2017 as Hunger Action Month in Newark, Ohio. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Also under communications, we have one from the Ohio Division of Liquor Control, a new application for Family Dollar Stores of Ohio, Inc., and an email from Daniel Crawford regarding nonpartisan elections, and a plea for creation of the Charter Review Study Group. Without objection, those will be received and filed. Next, we have comments from citizens. There are 2 sections for comments from citizens. One is now and one is after the legislation. Basically, this is not a debate with council. This is just your chance to be heard. Do we have anyone this evening who would like to speak during this first section? Okay. Next, we'll move on to ordinances on the first reading, 17-34.
Ordinance 17-34 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, Mr. Koss, Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Rapp. It's an ordinance to provide for the issuance of $5,040,000 of bond anticipation notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of refunding outstanding bond anticipation notes previously issued for the purpose of paying the cost of the replacement of water main and service lines and all necessary appurtenances, including but not limited to hydrants, valves, and fittings, and to provide additional funds to pay for other water system improvements and declaring an emergency.
17-34 is on the first reading, but it is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee.
make a motion to adopt ordinance 17-34.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. Is there any discussion on 17-34? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bubb? Mr. Koss?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-34 passes 9-0. Next on the first reading, we have 17-35.
Ordinance 17-35 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, Mr. Koss, Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Rapp, an ordinance providing for the issuance of not to exceed $1,150,000 various purpose refunding bonds and declaring an emergency.
You've heard the first reading of 17-35. It is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Marmee.
Make a motion to adopt ordinance 17-35.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. Is there any discussion on 17-35? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Koss?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-35 passes 9-0. Next, we have 17-36.
Ordinance 17-36 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, Mr. Koss, Mrs. Floyd, and Mr. Rapp. It's an ordinance providing for the issuance of not to exceed $1,200,000 of storm sewer improvement refunding bonds and declaring an emergency.
Once again, 17-36 is on the first reading, but it is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Marmee.
Make a motion to adopt ordinance 17-36.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. Any discussion on 17-36? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Koss?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-36 passes 9-0. Next, we have 17-37.
Ordinance 17-37 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Koss, and Mr. Rapp. An ordinance providing for the issuance of not to exceed $1,050,000 for landfill reclamation project refunding bonds and declaring an emergency.
17-37 is on the first reading, but it is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Marmee.
Make a motion to adopt ordinance 17-37.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. Is there any discussion on 17-37? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Koss?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-37 passes 9-0. Next, we have 17-38.
Ordinance 17-38 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Cost, Mr. Rapp. An ordinance providing for the issuance of not to exceed $1,600,000 in storm sewer improvement refunding bonds and declaring an emergency.
Sounding familiar, this 17-38 is on its first reading. It is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Marmee.
Make a motion to adopt ordinance 17-38.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. Is there any discussion on 17-38? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Cost?
Yes.
Mr. Cost, sorry. Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-38 passes 9-0. That's Mr. Cost voted twice. Mrs. Cost. Next, we have 17-39.
Ordinance 17-39 by Mr. Rapp, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, Mrs. Floyd, and Mr. Cost. An ordinance authorizing and directing the Newark City Safety Director to certify to the Licking County Auditor the sum of $165,262.06 incurred by the Newark City Property Maintenance Department with respect to property maintenance violations to be placed as a lien upon certain parcels of real property situated in the city of Newark, Ohio.
17-39 will be held for 2 weeks for a second reading. And now we move on to resolutions on the second reading, 17-60.
Resolution 17-60 by Mr. Rapp, Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Koss, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, and Mr. Lang. A resolution proposing the creation of a Special Improvement District, Downtown Newark Special Improvement District, Inc., along with the required petitions, the initial articles of incorporation, and the proposed plan for services for the Special Improvement District.
You've heard the second reading of 17-60. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Rapp.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt 17-60.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Rath, second by Mr. Cost. Is there any discussion on 17-60? Seeing none, on, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Cos?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-60 passes 9-0. Next on the second reading, we have 17-61.
Resolution 17-61 by Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Cos, Mr. Rapp, a resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
You've heard the second reading of 17-61. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee?
Oh, Mr. Lang.
I'm sorry.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt Resolution 17-61.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Lang, second by Mr. Frazier. I'm so used to Mr. President down there being Mr. Marmee. I'm sorry. Is there any discussion on 17-61? Seeing none, on, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Cos?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-61 passes 9-0. Finally, we've got a resolutions on the first reading, 17-62.
Resolution 17-62 by Mr. Marmee, Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Cos, a resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
17-62.
Mr. President.
Mr. Marmee?
Make a motion to waive the 2-day reading rule on Resolution 17-62.
Motion to waive the 2-day reading rule by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. Mr. Marmee?
Yes, we have a termination which we need to give a refund back or payout to an individual, and it needs to be expedited, plus we have some bills that we need to pay immediately.
Thank you, Mr. Marmee. I'll please call the roll to waive the 2-day reading rule.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Cos?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
2-day reading rule has been waived, Mr. Marmee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Make a motion to adopt Resolution 17-62.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Marmee, second by Mrs. Floyd. Is there any other discussion on 17-62? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Cos?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-62 passes 9-0. Next on the first reading, we have 17-63.
Resolution 17-63 by Mr. Rapp, Mr. Marmee, Mrs. Floyd, Mr. Cos, and Mr. Frazier, a resolution authorizing and directing the Director of Public Service to accept bids and sell certain surplus personal property now owned by the City of Newark, Ohio, and declaring that such property is no longer needed for any municipal purpose and declaring an emergency.
17-63 is on its first reading, but it is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Rapp?
I'd like to make a motion to adopt 17-63.
Sounds like me. Motion by Mr. Rath, second by Mr. Cost. Is there any discussion on 17-63?
Mr. President.
Mr. Rath?
This is an auction. We're having surplus items as well as impounded vehicles, bicycles on Saturday, October 28th at dark 30 in the morning. I'm not sure the exact time, but we do need to make some deadlines to advertise the auction. That's the reason for the emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Rath. Any other discussion on 17-63? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub? Mr. Cos?
Yes.
Mrs. Floyd?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Mangus?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
And Mr. Rapp?
Yes.
17-63 passes 9-0. And finally, tonight, on the first reading, we have 17-64.
Resolution 17-64 by Mr. Rapp, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Cos, Mrs. Floyd, and Mr. Frazier, a resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service to prepare and submit applications to participate in the Ohio Public Works Commission State Capital Improvement Program and to execute contracts as required.
17-64 will be held for 2 weeks for second reading. And that concludes our legislation tonight. Thanks for your attention. Okay, once again, our second opportunity for comments from citizens. Once again, it's not a debate with council, it's just your opportunity to be heard. Do we have any? Anyone from administration this evening? Our Honorable Alderman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do miss having William Butcher here to give the weather report.
so that I could conveniently follow that up with the sports report, but since William's not here, I'll pass.
You can go ahead if you want.
That's okay.
Thank you,
Sure it
Director
wouldn't be
Sassen.
well received.
Mayor Hall.
I will pass this evening, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Blake.
I'll pass, thank you.
Mr. Cost. I will pass. Thank you. Mrs. Floyd.
Street committee, that's fine. That's it, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mrs. Floyd. Mr. Frazier.
Thank you, President Ellington. So, I'm really excited for what was on the agenda tonight. We have the Special Improvement Tax District. We have a lot of bond reorganizations in order to manage our long-term debt, and we continue to see progress being made in our community. Throughout this year, we have seen debate back and forth on the medical marijuana issue, and so the state government has released their final laws regarding dispensaries, and I did a quick review. I've been working on legislation in which I will provide to the law director this week to compile it in a form, and will hopefully bring to committee in 3 weeks. Highlights as far as what the rules state. Rule 3796, according to the state of Ohio, is 500 feet from a school, church, library, public playground, and public park, as well as 500 feet from an addiction services provider. And they have also categorized the state into multiple districts, of which we reside in District 4, consisting of Licking, Knox, Morrow, and Delaware counties, of which 3 dispensaries are allowed in those 4 counties. So with that, the key for the legislation that I want to present is to provide adequate zoning and sufficient oversight for the state of Ohio, or for the city of Newark, in order to make sure that we are aware of what dispensaries are provided provisional licenses, what dispensaries have permanent license, and set a framework in place to make sure they maintain a communication channel and keep us up to date and within compliance with the state. And so I wanted to make that announcement to make sure that everybody's aware, keep everybody on the same page, and work through this issue diligently and as effectively as possible. And with that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier. Ms. Hall.
I'll pass, thank you.
Ms. Hall. Mr. Lang.
I need to call a capital improvements meeting. With that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. Mr. Magus.
I'd like to thank President Ellington for allowing our guest Pledge of Allegiance person this evening. And with that, I'll pass.
She is much cuter than you are. Mr. Martin.
Yes, I need to call a finance committee meeting. Did you say that there needs to be a personnel committee meeting?
Go ahead, yeah, okay.
Okay, call personnel committee meeting, and with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Marmy. And Mr. Rapp.
Thank you. Mr. Sassen, I understand that William is looking for a regular ride if you'd be willing to volunteer. I'm sure you guys could work out something about weather and sports.
Available.
At least during the football season, right?
Just to let you know that. With that, I'll call a service committee meeting and I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Rapp. Ellie, thanks for doing the pledge tonight. Appreciate it. Thank you. With that, our next committee meeting is September 25th, 5:30 here in this room. And our next full council meeting will be the following Monday, October 2nd, 7 o'clock. Motion adjourned. Motion by Mr. Scott, second by Mr. Rapp. All those in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Same sign. We're adjourned.